Episode 1. If you had set out in the summer of 1660 to travel the 4 miles from Boston to Cambridge, Massachusetts, the first house you would have come to after crossing the Charles River would have been the Gookins. It stood beside the road on the southern edge of the small settlement, a confident 2-storied timbered property in its own fenced lot. That year, the colony was building its first bridge across the river. Thick wooden piles were being driven into the mud close to the ramp where the ferryboat ran. On this particular day, Friday the 27th of July, the front door was flung wide open and a childish sign reading, "Welcome Home," had been nailed to the gatepost. A passing student had reported that a ship from London, the Prudent Mary, had dropped anchor that morning between Boston and Charlestown. Among her passengers was believed to be Mr. Daniel Gookin, the master of the property, returning to America after an absence of 2 years. All 5 children were waiting with Mrs. Gookin in the parlour: Mary, who was 20 and named after her mother, Elizabeth, 18, and their 3 younger brothers, Daniel, Samuel, and 4-year-old Nathaniel, who had no memory of his father and was fidgeting in his chair. Mrs. Gookin took him onto her lap, stroked his hair, and spoke of the man who would soon walk through the door, of his goodness and kindness, and his important work for the government in London, where he had been summoned by the Lord Protector himself. "What's a Lord Protector?" "Protector, child. He was the ruler of England and America." "Like a king?" "Yes, like a king, only better, because he was chosen by Parliament. But the Protector is dead now. That's why your father is coming home." Nat's eyes widened. "If the Protector is dead, then who will protect us?" It was a question that had defeated the cleverest minds in England, and Mrs. Gookin found herself stuck for an answer. "Go outside, boys, and wait for him there." Nat scrambled off her lap, and all 3 darted for the door like cats released from a sack. Later, Daniel called from outside, "It's Papa in a cart." They dashed down the road to meet it. "Is it really him?" asked Mrs. Gookin. "Yes, it's him," said Mary, before adding in a puzzled voice, "But he has 2 men with him." In the immediate flurry of kisses and embraces, the pair of strangers, who remained throughout politely seated in the back of the cart among the luggage, were at first ignored. Finally, Gookin placed his hand around her waist, whispered, "There are men here you must meet. Do not be alarmed," and ushered her towards the cart. "Gentlemen, allow me to present my wife, the true Prudent Mary, in flesh and blood at last." A pair of weather-beaten, ragged-bearded heads turned to examine her. Hats were lifted to reveal long, matted hair. They wore buff leather overcoats, caked with salt, and high-sided, scuffed brown boots. As they stood, somewhat stiffly, the thick leather creaked, and Mary caught a whiff of sea and sweat and mildew, as if they had been fished up from the bed of the Atlantic. "Mary," continued Gookin, "these are 2 good friends of mine who shared the crossing with me. Colonel Edward Whalley and his son-in-law, Colonel William Goffe." He clapped his hands. "Boys, fetch the Colonel's bags for them." She spoke quietly so they could not hear. "How long are they to stay?" "As long as it is necessary." "Why here? Are there no rooms to be had in Boston?" "The governor believes Cambridge a safer lodging place. Boston is full of rogues and royalists, whereas here they will be among the godly." "They're not visitors from England, then, so much as fugitives?" He made no answer. "From what is it they run?" By the time he spoke, the men had gone inside. He said quietly, "They killed the king." In England, it was almost 9 in the evening. Isabel Hacker was ready to do anything to help her husband, at that moment held in the Tower on suspicion of treason. She gathered that Richard Naylor, now standing in her husband's study, was some kind of clerk to the Privy Council. She held out to him a footling little thing, 8 inches long or thereabouts, the death warrant of Charles Stuart, King of England, Scotland and Ireland, as handed to Colonel Francis Hacker, commander of the troops guarding the king, on the morning of His Majesty's execution by Oliver Cromwell himself. Naylor laid it on the colonel's desk and scanned the 50-odd signatures beneath the text, arranged in 7 columns. Beside each man's name was a red wax seal. They spattered across the document like drops of blood. "But my husband's name is not among them?" His gaze travelled back over the signatories. "No, but his name is here nonetheless." He turned the parchment round and pointed. "The warrant is in fact addressed to your husband first and foremost. The reason, I assume, why it's in his possession." "But only as a soldier, as an officer obeying orders, not issuing them." "That will be for the court to decide. It's late, Mrs. Hacker." He saw a couch in a corner of the room. "I'll spend the night in here, with your permission, and leave at first light. I suggest you withdraw for the night and pray for your husband." His mouth twitched in a slight smile. Whatever happens next is God's will, after all. How many times had he heard that sanctimonious formula over the past 11 years? Let them see how they liked it now. He sat at the colonel's desk and read it again. The severing of his head from his body in the open street before Whitehall. It still had the power to shock. He opened his jacket, unbuttoned his shirt, and bowed his head to remove the leather cord that had hung around his neck for the past 11 years. Attached to it was a small pouch. Inside the pouch was a tiny piece of blood-stained linen. He turned it over between his fingers. The martyr's blood had dried over the years to a faded, rusty colour. Perhaps one day it would disappear. But as long as it existed, Naylor had vowed to do all in his power to avenge the events of that January day. Daniel Gookin was in their bedroom, lying with his arms flung wide. She lifted her skirt and climbed onto the bed beside him. 10 minutes later, there was a thud above their heads, and then the scrape of a heavy object being dragged across the floor. He looked at the ceiling. "You have lodged them in the attic?" "It was their choice." "How did you come to know them, Dan?" "You remember Reverend Hook of New Haven, who returned to England some years ago?" "Of course." "His wife is Colonel Whalley's sister. Hook asked me to arrange passage for his brother-in-law, and then Ned persuaded Will to join us." "And why was it so urgent for them to leave?" "The King's son is returning to the throne by invitation of Parliament. The army has agreed, or most of it, and England is to be a republic no more." "Why did the army agree to such a thing?" "A new law, what they call an Act of Oblivion, has been laid before Parliament. The past is to be forgotten. There's to be an amnesty for all who took up arms against the late king, with one exception. All those regicides, as they call them, who had direct involvement in the trial and execution of Charles Stuart, are required to surrender themselves for judgment." He took her hand. "This was 10 weeks ago. Ours is the first ship to reach Boston with the news. I had to go and tell the governor as soon as we came ashore." "How many of these regicides came over with you?" "These 2 only. They're good men, Mary. Ned was Cromwell's cousin. They're in need of sanctuary until things quieten down. There's nothing to fear. No one knows they're here, save you and me and the governor." "Colonel Whalley was Cromwell's cousin? Oh, Daniel, they'll come after them for sure." Down on the river, both banks were deserted. Water glistened invitingly in the sunlight. Ned, at his post at the window, felt a rush of contentment. Behind him, Will was laying out their armoury on the bed. 4 matchlock pistols, 2 bags of powder, a box of bullets, 2 knives, a pair of swords. He had barely spoken since they came into the house. "Leave that, Will." Ned searched through his bag, pulled out 2 clean shirts and threw one to him. "Let's go down to the river. It'll do us good to be rid of this salt." "Shouldn't we ask Gookin first?" "He's our host, not a jailer. The governor said it was safe for us to move freely here." He took a step forward, gripped Will by the forearms and shook him gently. "You'll see your wife and little ones again, I'm sure of it, my sweet Francis and the grandchildren. God will not allow the wicked to triumph for long. We must have patience and faith." Will nodded. "You're right. Forgive me." They scouted out a place a little way off the road, where part of the riverbank had been eroded by the current to form a natural pool. Ned pulled off his boots and stripped off his brine-stiffened clothes and waded naked into the river. The cold made him shout out loud. Will laughed, then pulled his shirt over his head and quickly removed the rest of his clothes. What a sight they made, thought Ned, with their dead white bodies and their battle scars, like phantoms amid the lush greenery. Will had a jagged line across his stomach from a royalist pike at Naseby. He himself an ugly fist-sized crater beneath his right shoulder, sustained when he was knocked off his horse at Dunbar. Will launched himself into a dive, full length. He disappeared beneath the surface, then bobbed up moments later. Ned rolled over onto his back. Catherine floated into his mind. Where was she? How was she? It was 4 years since she had miscarried and almost died, and her health and spirit had never properly recovered. But what was the use of tormenting himself, as Will did every night, with impossible speculations? One of them must be strong. They had a duty to stay alive, not for themselves, but for the cause. Richard Naylor let himself out of Stathern Hall on Saturday morning as soon as it was light. He wrapped the death warrant in a piece of cloth, placed it carefully in one of the saddlebags, and strapped it tight. By 5, he was on his way. He rode at a gallop. The only time he slowed his pace was early in the afternoon, when he recognized from the milestones that he must be passing close to the battlefield of Naseby. Somewhere near here, Prince Rupert's cavalry had charged uphill towards the enemy, only to find 1,000 Ironsides thundering down upon them from their flank through the early summer mist, commanded, he discovered afterwards, by Colonel Edward Whalley. He had managed to fire off a shot before the Roundhead cavalry smashed into their front line, and his mount was cut from under him. He had lain among the dead all day, trapped beneath his slain horse, bleeding, his ribs shattered, hip broken, unable to move. At nightfall, he fell unconscious. The next thing he remembered was 2 Roundhead musketeers standing over him. They slung him into a cart, and he had survived, although often in the following months he wished that he had not. But here he was, against all odds, alive and on the winning side, and he would not make the mistake of showing mercy. He spurred his horse and resumed his southern dash, a streak of dust, an avenging fury. Episode 2. At Worcester House, the Lord Chancellor's private study was little more than a closet, wood-panelled, airless, and gloomy. Yet it was from here that England was run. A heavy table covered with a Turkish rug occupied most of the floor. Naylor took in the committee at a glance. Sir William Morris on one side, Sir Anthony Ashley Cooper and Sir Arthur Annesley opposite him, and at the head of the table facing the door, the King's First Minister, Sir Edward Hyde. He was reading the warrant. He did not look up.
What kind of man preserves such a document, even when his enemies have returned to power and he knows it must hang him? Can you answer me that, Mr. Naylor?
A fanatic, my lord.
Well, then, I believe he has met his match in you.
Hyde lifted his gaze from the warrant and studied Naylor out of the corner of his eye.
Leicestershire and back in 4 days. That is a feat. You did not think of sending someone else?
I considered it too important. Hyde nodded.
It is. This will stir up Parliament again. How many of these signatories are still at liberty?
From his bag, Naylor extracted a list he had made on Friday night in Hacker's study. You will see that 59 traitors signed it. Of these, 20 have since died. 25 are in our custody. One has been granted a pardon by His Majesty in return for his assistance in catching the others, which leaves 13 still at large.
And who are they?
Asked Morris. Whalley, he replied, running his finger down the names. Livesey, Oakey, Goffe, Hewson, Blagrave, Ludlow, Buxted, Dixwell, Walton, Say, Challoner, and Corbett. Hyde threw the warrant onto the table.
There is no end to it. Only 4 men were to die for murdering the king. That was our agreement when we negotiated the Act of Oblivion. And then we found the records of the trial, or rather you did, Mr. Naylor. And now there are dozens of them.
Morris said, You are not suggesting we should leave these 13 at liberty, my lord?
No, Sir William, indeed I am not. We must hunt them down. But I propose we concentrate our efforts on those we have in custody. We should transfer the prisoners directly to the Tower and bring them to trial as quickly as possible.
Naylor said, And the catching of the rest?
That can be your responsibility, Mr. Naylor, since the work is plainly to your taste.
Hyde held out the warrant.
You had better deliver this to the Tower.
Naylor rose from his seat and went round the table to collect it.
Keep us informed of your progress. Now I have a sensitive matter I wish to discuss with my colleagues.
Naylor gathered he was dismissed. He picked up his bag and bowed to the committee. Outside the room, he lingered for a moment, ostensibly to put away the warrant, but actually to listen. He heard Morris's voice approving. Now he's a zealous fellow. And then Hyde's high-pitched, wheezing rejoinder, 200 miles in 4 days? What makes him run so hard, I wonder? Further along the south side of the Strand stood Essex House, the London residence of the first Marquess of Hertford. It was not so much a house nowadays as a warren of lodgings, and it was here that Naylor lived as part of the Marquess's household. The heat of 4 days' shut-up air struck his face like the opening of an oven. A column of flies circled in the centre of the room that served as his study. Every surface was covered with spreading heaps of yellowing papers. He opened the window. In the hope of creating a draught, he went through to his small corner bedroom and opened another one. This room he kept free of paper and bare of decoration, save for a miniature of his wife that hung above his dressing table. She gazed at him now from beneath her dark ringlets, wearing a quizzical expression, intelligent, amused. He had seen her last on Christmas Day 1657, when the household had gathered illegally in the private chapel to celebrate the Nativity. The doors banged open, and a file of soldiers marched in and surrounded the congregation. They aimed their muskets, but permitted the communicants to finish receiving their wine and wafers. There were no officers amongst them, Naylor noted as he escorted Sarah back to their pew, and he guessed those must be their orders. When they were seated, she took his hand and placed it on her belly. He felt the kick beneath his palm. He realized afterwards it was her way of telling him not to do anything foolish, and he resolved as such. But when 2 colonels did at last appear, and strutted up the aisle to the altar demanding to know the reason for this unlawful assembly, he felt a rage begin to rise within him. "This is an ordinary weekday like any other," said the younger of the pair. "To celebrate the superstition of the Nativity is forbidden by Act of Parliament." No one said a word. In the silence, Naylor found himself saying, "It is not illegal to worship God. It is illegal to use the Book of Common Prayer, which is but the Catholic Mass in English." He felt Sarah clutching at his arm, but he could not stop himself. "And yet I thought you fought the war for liberty of conscience. Liberty of conscience, sir, not treason. The Book of Common Prayer means you pray particularly for Charles Stuart. Do you deny it? We pray for all Christian kings, princes, and governors. The older officer said, Then you pray for the King of Spain, who is an enemy and a papist. We pray only to God to bless all rulers. There are no papists here. The colonels had had enough. Arrest him. He had no time to say goodbye to Sarah, or even properly to look at her. A pair of soldiers had already come up behind him. He was marched all the way to Newgate Prison, where he was thrown into a cell and left to rot for the next 6 months. And when he came out, he learned that the baby, a boy, had been born dead on the night of his arrest, the premature labour brought on by the shock, and that Sarah had died giving birth to him.
What makes him run so hard, I wonder?
Well, that would make a man run pretty hard, would you not say, your lordship? Especially when the two officers who had ordered his arrest were Colonel Whalley and Colonel Goffe, wanted for the murder of the king and still at liberty somewhere on God's fair earth. The officers sat in the Gookin's parlour and received a succession of neighbours anxious to meet the two most senior Englishmen ever to set foot in America. In particular, the news that Ned was a blood relation of Cromwell had spread far and fast. What was he like? That question, again and again. He was remarkable, was the most that Ned would say. Such fame made them both uneasy. 13 days after their arrival in America, John Norton, minister of the Boston First Church, brought with him a letter from the elders of his church inviting the colonels to attend a lecture to be given by him the following afternoon. Ned read the letter and handed it to Will. Will shook his head. Governor Endicott advised us to remain in Cambridge. I say we should consult the governor first. Norton smiled. The governor will be there. They set off shortly after noon the next day, wearing swords. As extra protection, they carried pistols concealed beneath their leather coats. It was a marvellous thing, after so many months, to stroll freely again through a proper town. Among so many hundreds, the colonels passed unnoticed. After the discussion ended, they emerged into the dull afternoon and were standing on the forecourt. "Edward Whalley!" shouted an astonished voice. Ned stopped speaking and looked around. A group of rough-looking fellows, apparently slouching into town from the direction of the harbour, had halted opposite the church, and one of them was pointing at him. "I know yon bastard," he yelled to everyone within earshot. "He took me prisoner at Dunbar." The Puritans moved off up the sidewalk. The Scotsman and his companions swerved to follow them and kept pace alongside. "Whalley! Whalley!" chanted his tormentor. "And I'll warrant the other one's Goffe, his son-in-law, both wanted for the murder of the king." Ned moved to draw his sword, but Will grabbed his arm to stop him. "Not here, not yet." They reached Norton's house. The door slammed shut behind them and was barred and bolted. Inside, the Puritans stood in hushed groups of 2 or 3, occasionally glancing at the officers. Ned was breathing hard. His blood was up. Endicott looked thoughtful. "I had not realized you were at Dunbar. We have many Scotchmen in the colony, veterans of the King's army. Boston may be more hazardous for you than I anticipated." He beckoned to a heavy-set man. "Captain Mickelson, would you be good enough to fetch some militiamen to escort our honoured guest back to Cambridge?" As soon as Mickelson had gone, the mood among the assembly eased a little. Gradually the parlour became noisy with conversation. A loud knock came at the door. Endicott said, "That will be Mickelson. Let him in, Mr. Norton." But when Norton unlocked the door, it was a very different figure who was standing on the threshold. Tall, well-dressed, erect and confident. Behind him was the Scotsman from earlier in the afternoon, along with his companions. Norton tried to shut the door, but the stranger stuck out his boot to keep it open. Ned drew his sword, and this time Will did the same. "Mr. Norton," said the stranger politely. "Good day to you." He touched his hat. "I am Captain Thomas Breeden." "I know who you are," replied Norton. "This is a private meeting." Breeden craned his neck to peer around him. "And there is Mr. Endicott. Good day to you, Governor. And there, if I am not mistaken, are Colonel Edward Whalley and Colonel William Goffe."
"Move aside, Mr. Norton," commanded Endicott.
He stepped in front of him.
"State your business, Captain Breeden."
"My business, Governor? Your business, surely. Those men are wanted for the murder of the king."
"So you say. I have received no warrant to that effect."
"Then allow me to read you the latest London newsletter." Breeden reached inside his coat and pulled out a printed sheet. "It came upon the Scottish ship this very day and reports a vote of Parliament. Here is the list of names of those who are to be seized." He put his finger on the paper and thrust it in the governor's face. "Those of Whalley and Goffe are quite plainly printed."
"Be that as it may," said Endicott, "that is a newsletter, not a warrant."
As the argument continued, Ned whispered to Norton, "Tell me, who is this Captain Breeden?" "A merchant of some means, a ship owner, a royalist, an enemy of the Puritan faith." He looked around. "Is there a back way out of your property?" "Of course." "What'd you say, Will? Should we withdraw?" "I think it would be prudent." The officers put away their swords and followed Norton through the kitchen and out into a yard. The minister opened a gate in the wall, stepped into the street, looked up and down, and returned a moment later. "The way is clear." They moved quickly, walking with long and rapid strides, until very soon they were out of the town. No one seemed to be following. Episode 3. On Tuesday the 28th of August, the Act of Oblivion was approved by Parliament, and the following day, as a reward for his efforts, Naylor was invited to accompany Sir Edward Hyde to the House of Lords to witness His Majesty sign it into law. Charles II was a big man, a foot or so taller than his father, and every inch the image of a king. In a voice of regal authority, he read out the speech that Hyde had written for him and Naylor had checked. It was soon over. The Oblivion Bill was presented to him by the clerks. He signed it, acknowledged the applause, then exited by the door through which he had entered. Hyde beckoned Naylor to follow him into the crowded chamber behind the throne. Half a dozen women were standing together, watching the king. One attendant at his back removed His Majesty's ermine robes. Another in front, on tiptoe, lifted off his crown. How ordinary he looked, suddenly, Naylor thought. The king was in profile, smiling and winking at the ladies. Hyde said,
"Your Majesty, may I present Mr. Richard Naylor? He has been most diligent in the matter of bringing to justice the murderers of your late father."
Reluctantly, the king turned away from the women and held out his hand. Naylor bowed and kissed it. "Your Majesty." "Mr. Naylor." He smiled and nodded and turned back to Hyde. "That went well enough, I think, Sir Edward."
"Your presence was commanding, Your Majesty."
The tallest of the women stepped in front of the Lord Chancellor. She took the king's arm. "Enough politics for one day, Sir Edward, surely. I think His Majesty needs an hour or two of rest." The king laughed, showing large white teeth, and allowed himself to be led away. Hyde tapped his stick against the floor.
"Rest. Is that what she calls it?"
"She is a great beauty," Naylor said carefully. "Who is she?"
"She is Mrs. Palmer. The king has just installed her in a house next to his palace."
Naylor was on alert at once. "And which house would that be, Sir Edward?"
"The closest one, of course. Whalley's old place."
The following afternoon, in his office, Naylor convened a meeting of those most closely associated with the hunt for the regicides. Pinned to a board propped up on an easel was a chart of all the wanted traitors, their names and last known locations. The usual 4 men attended. His secretary, Mr. Samuel Noakes, a diligent young lawyer; Dr. John Wallace, who had broken the cipher of the King's correspondence captured at Naseby, and who now, after some persuasion, was making his skills available to the new regime; Colonel Henry Bishop, the Postmaster General, who ensured the committee had prompt access to every letter that passed through the London sorting office; and Mr. William Prynne, the MP for Bath, the most fanatical of the anti-regicides in Parliament. Naylor raised the matter of Whalley and Goffe. He recounted how he had gone to Whalley's King Street house and learned that the families had left, then described his visit to Savoy Hospital and his discovery that they had moved on from there as well. Colonel Bishop said, "Do we believe them still to be together?" "My feeling is they are together," said Naylor. He thought of them that Christmas Day, standing at the altar in Essex House, berating the congregation. They often were when Cromwell was alive.
"I must confess, I find the completeness of their disappearance a surprise," said Wallace. "They are a void, as if they have vanished from the earth."
"I have begun to wonder," said Naylor, "if they might not have gone to America. Colonel Whalley's sister is married to a Puritan minister named Hook, who lived among some community of religious extremists over there for many years. If that is the case, it would explain why they seem to be so entirely removed from the rest."
"Then they must have sailed before the end of May," said Noakes, "because we have checked every passenger leaving England since then, unless they took ship from Holland."
"Surely we would have heard of that. Have one of our men go to the customs house, Mr. Noakes, and consult the passenger manifests for vessels sailing to America in April and May. They may have travelled under assumed names." Noakes made a note.
"Yes, sir."
"And do we have an informer among the Puritan community in Spitalfields?"
"We have several, Mr. Naylor."
"Then they should be directed to inquire discreetly after the whereabouts of Reverend Hook. Hook will lead us to the families, I am sure." 2 days later, on Saturday, Naylor was in his office when the door was thrown open and Noakes burst in.
"Hook has been found. He has been lent a country house by a wealthy Puritan merchant in the city."
"Whereabouts?"
"Just across the river, in Clapham village."
There was nothing to be said for the wretched state into which Frances Goffe now found herself plunged at the age of 26, save perhaps that it allowed her no time to brood on the calamity that had engulfed her. In the space of a few months, she had lost her husband and her father, her position in society, her home, possessions, money, servants, and all peace of mind, save for her strong and simple faith that God must have willed this for a purpose, and that it was her duty to endure it. She had 5 children under the age of 8. Betty and Nan, both sickly, were a particular worry, but they were less of a burden to her than her mother, who lay on the bed beside her, eyes open, unmoving, as Frances attempted to spoon some soup into her mouth while at the same time feeding her baby, Richard, who was sucking at her breast. The baby fell asleep. She laid him in his cot, and then lay down on her mattress and put her hand over her eyes.
Will.
He had set off to America nearly 4 months ago. She didn't know if he had arrived. It was too soon for word to have reached her. She sat up and felt around the edge of the mattress for the small cut she had made in the material. She inserted her fingers into the straw and pulled out the only 3 things she had left of him: a lock of his hair, a miniature portrait, and the last note he had sent her on the day he took ship. Uncle William had brought it back from Gravesend after he had seen them off. "Dearest heart, God will protect us, for he makes all things right on earth. Pray for me, as I pray always for you, the greatest gift he has bestowed upon me. I will come back to you again, as soon as I am able." It was written in Will's elaborate hand on a small piece of paper torn roughly from a notebook. It was unsigned and undated. She heard her aunt calling her name. She replaced her treasures deep inside the mattress and went upstairs to see what she could do to help. Several hours later, Uncle William hurried in with apples from the orchard to report that soldiers on horseback were approaching down the lane. Frances saw the fear in his face.
You think they're coming for us? How is this the only house? Where else might they be headed?
She scooped Nan up from the kitchen floor and handed her to Frankie, told her to take her little sister and Judith up to their room, where Betty was still in bed.
Stay there till I tell you to come down.
From the garden came the sound of horses and men's voices. A pair of soldiers hurried past the kitchen window. The house was being surrounded. An instant later, there was a hammering at the door. Uncle William opened it a little and was roughly pushed aside by men armed with pistols and drawn swords, who poured into the house. Some ran into the parlour, others clumped upstairs. 2 soldiers trained muskets on Francis and the others and shouted at them not to move. A moment later, a short, broad-shouldered man strolled into the kitchen. Reverend William Hook, I assume? He touched his hat politely and turned to Aunt Jane. And you are Mrs. Catherine Whalley?
No, sir. My name is Jane Hook.
Forgive me. He looked at Frances. Therefore you must be Mrs. Goffe. He studied her for a moment. His eyes were very dark. Something flickered in them, a kind of knowingness or intimacy that made her flesh shrink. Where is Mrs. Catherine Whalley? Frances said,
She is in bed, sir, ill.
Show me, please.
Wait,
Uncle William said.
By what authority do you invade our house?
There is a warrant issued for the arrest of Colonel Whalley and Colonel Goffe, as you well know. One of the soldiers shouted downstairs,
There's no one up here, Mr. Naylor, save some young girls.
Frances saw Naylor's mouth briefly set in disappointment. Well, that is no surprise. He turned to her. You'll doubtless tell me you've no notion where they are.
I haven't seen my husband or my father for many months.
Is that so? He called upstairs. Search the place thoroughly. And then to Frances again. Take me to Mrs. Whalley. She led him into the parlour. Her mother had drawn her blanket up to her chin and was staring at the ceiling. Naylor bent to examine her. He passed his hand above her eyes. There was no reaction. How long has she been this way?
Since she was put out of her house into the street with nothing to her name.
The baby began to cry. Frances moved towards him, but Naylor was there before her. He lifted Dickie out of his cot and held him at arm's length, turning him from side to side, appraising him like a piglet at market. Now he is a fine little fellow. It must be a splendid thing to have a healthy baby boy. Frances held out her hands.
Give him to me, please.
Naylor cradled the baby against his chest and began to rock him, stroking his back. The crying stopped. There, you see. I have a gift with infants. Tell me where your husband is, Mrs. Goffe. Life will be better for your baby, and for all of you.
I cannot tell you what I do not know.
He called to the kitchen. Captain Weaver, come and search in here, if you please. Weaver came in with 2 more soldiers. Start with the bed. Take your sword to the mattress. The captain glanced doubtfully at Catherine Whalley. What shall we do with her? If she won't move, tip her out. Aunt Jane said,
This is not human, Mr. Naylor.
What is not human is to kill your king in cold blood. Get on with it, Captain.
Wait,
Frances said. She untied the string around her mattress and rolled it out. She knelt and put her hand into the cut and extracted the note, the picture, and the lock of hair. She offered them to Naylor. Finally, he gave her the baby in exchange. She took her son and held him tight and watched Naylor as he read the note. This is from your husband? She nodded.
Frances,
warned Uncle William.
When did you receive it? A week ago.
The lie came easily. Who brought it?
I did not see. It was delivered in the night. It was here in the morning when I awoke.
And the likeness is his?
Yes.
He read the message through again, noting the ornateness of the script. He studied the miniature portrait closely. He grasped the lock of hair between thumb and forefinger and held it to the light. To see such precious keepsakes in his hands made her feel faint. She tried to control her trembling. "Good," he said at last. "The note and the picture I shall take. The hair you may keep." Episode 4. For Naylor, the hour of retribution was approaching. A festival of blood. There was a late-night visit to Naylor's apartment from Isabel Hacker with a plea for mercy. He had a word with Hyde the following morning, and the colonel, by the king's gracious clemency, was killed by hanging only, and his remains returned to his family for burial. The heads of the other 9 regicides were placed on spikes around Westminster Hall, on London Bridge, and in other public places. Their quarters were nailed over the city gates. The Act of Oblivion had been accomplished, and the king's government turned with relief to other matters. Except for Naylor. At the end of November, he convened another meeting of his intelligence committee, Noakes, Wallace, Bishop, Prynne, to review the progress of the manhunt. He took satisfaction in revising his chart of wanted men, running a line through the names of all those who had been dealt with. But of the rest, the news was entirely frustrating. "The King's proclamation and reward have most certainly yielded us nothing," said Bishop. "It is disappointing," said Naylor, "and surprising." "I think, perhaps," said Noakes cautiously, "they may never have come back to England in the first place." As the weeks had passed without result, Naylor had been forced to consider that possibility himself. He had thought often of Frances Goffe. Some quality about her reminded him of his late wife. He even entertained a fantasy that... But no, that was impossible. He was certainly reluctant to accept she might have tricked him. Noakes produced a sheet of paper and laid it on the table. "This is the manifest of a vessel named the Prudent Mary. She sailed from Gravesend on the 14th of May. Her master, a Captain Pierce, is a well-known Puritan. So are some of her passengers. Daniel Gookin served as collector of customs under Cromwell. William Jones may be the son of Colonel John Jones, the regicide lately executed. Whalley and Goffe are not listed, but 2 names caught my eye, a Mr. Richardson and a Mr. Stevenson, written down one after the other, suggesting they were travelling together." "Those are common enough names, surely." "Indeed, but then I remembered that Whalley's father was named Richard, and Goffe's was called Stephen." Naylor ended the meeting and rode at a gallop to Clapham. He dismounted a little way up the lane, drew his pistol, and approached the cottage on foot. "If any person or persons shall directly or indirectly conceal, harbour, keep, retain, or maintain the said Edward Whalley and William Goffe, we will proceed against them with all severity." That was the law, and he would enforce it. He would put her in jail. He would take away her baby. He would sweat the truth out of her. He opened the gate quietly and walked towards the house. The door was locked. The place deserted. The first snowfall of the winter came to Massachusetts in the middle of December. At the end of the month, a packet of mail arrived on a ship from Bristol. Daniel took it into the parlour to read at his desk. That night, just as Ned and Will were finishing their evening prayers before getting into bed, there was a knock at the attic door, and the Gookins came in together. Without saying a word, Daniel held out a printed document. Ned and Will sat on the bed to read it. It was a proclamation, signed by the King, offering a reward of £100 a head, dead or alive, for the execrable traitors Colonel Edward Whalley and Colonel William Goffe, and promising dire punishment to anyone caught harbouring them. The date showed that it had taken 3 months to travel from Whitehall Palace to Boston, Massachusetts. "At least they think we are in England," said Ned. Daniel said, "Unfortunately, they will realise their error soon enough, and Governor Endicott will find a royal warrant hard to ignore." Will lowered his head and clasped his hands behind his neck. "We must leave your house. Our presence endangers you all. And where will you go in the middle of winter? This proclamation will be displayed all over the colony. There's no place for you to run." He exchanged a glance with Mary and took her hand. "We have talked the matter through, and are both agreed." Mary said, "We'll hide you. We'll say you left in the night without warning." Will started to object, but Ned put his hand on his knee to quiet him. "Hide us where?" "In the barn," said Daniel. In Cambridge, the vanishing of the English officers coincided with the posting of the reward outside the general store. It meant the Gookins' story that they must have taken fright and fled in the darkness was accepted as plausible. Only the minister, Reverend Mitchell, seemed sceptical. One day, towards the end of January, Mitchell came to call. He brought with him 2 thick pamphlets that had just arrived from London, one a record of the trial of the regicides, and the other a collection of the final prayers and speeches of those who had been executed. "I read these yesterday," he said, "and I commend them to you both." He placed them on the table. "I believe we should hold a public meeting to discuss the killing of the king." Daniel looked at him in surprise. "You do not think it justified?" "I am uncertain. I am praying for God's guidance on the issue. I advise you to do the same." "God has already guided me, Jonathan. The killing of a tyrant is no crime." "The most learned minds in England disagree with you." "Learned minds can still believe wicked things, especially when their own interests are at stake." "Even so, we must obey the law." The minister seemed to be expecting an invitation to sit. When none was forthcoming, he put on his hat and buttoned up his coat. Daniel watched him through the snow-stippled window. He stood in the yard, contemplating the barn. For a minute or two he watched it, then finally made his way carefully along the slippery path and out through the gate. "It is as plain as day he suspects us of still hiding them," Daniel said to Mary. "And now I suppose I must go and tell Ned and Will that their comrades are dead." The officers were awake most of that night, reading by candlelight. The news was both expected and yet at the same time shocking to see in cold print. Ned recited the names of each of the 10 who had been executed, and they paused after each and meditated. And at the end, Will said a prayer for the repose of their souls. "I should have died with them," Will said. "They are with the Lord, while we skulk like rats in a barn." Ned spoke quietly. "I'm not afraid of a traitor's death, but I truly believe that God has chosen a different path for us. To stay alive, to keep the flame, and to bear witness. Their pain is over. Ours goes on, and I maintain that our duty is to extend it as long as we can." The fate of their old comrades shamed them into activity. Ned borrowed a drill and bit from Daniel and bored a hole in the wall of the hayloft, big enough for him to insert his spyglass. They exercised, press-ups and chest pulls from the edge of the loft. They kept their weapons clean and loaded. They needed to be ready. In the middle of January, Naylor was summoned by Hyde to Worcester House to be given an unwelcome new task: exhuming the bodies of Oliver Cromwell, his son-in-law Henry Ireton, and the president of the regicide court, John Bradshaw, from their tombs in Westminster Abbey and arranging for their posthumous execution at Tyburn on the 12th anniversary of the king's murder. He recoiled at the prospect. On the morning of the 30th of January, Naylor rode behind the hurdles as the bodies were dragged through the streets to Tyburn, where a crowd of several thousand waited to witness them being hanged together. That afternoon, the corpses were lifted down and decapitated, their heads taken away in a sack to be stuck on 20-foot poles and hoisted above the law courts in Westminster Hall. Naylor supervised all of this, and then at dusk went straight to a whorehouse in Milford Lane. All he desired was to lose himself in living flesh. The next morning he sent word to Noakes that he was sick. In the days that followed, he stayed mostly in bed and saw no one. These periodic fits of black dog had afflicted him since his youth. One morning he was disturbed by a loud hammering at his door. He put a coat on over his nightgown, shuffled across the floor, and opened the door a crack. In the dim light of the passage was a tall man, smartly dressed. "Mr. Richard Naylor?" Naylor squinted at him. "Who wants him?" "My name is Captain Thomas Breeden, sir." The man took off his hat and bowed. "I have a tale to tell you, Mr. Naylor, which I believe may be of interest." In Cambridge, the snow began to thaw in the middle of February. For several days they saw nothing of Daniel Gookin. He had gone to Boston to attend a meeting of the Massachusetts Bay Colony's State Council, of which he was an elected member. On the night of Monday the 25th, soon after they heard him return, it started snowing afresh onto icy ground. Ned lay awake, listening to the rustle of it landing, once more deadening and deepening the vast silence beyond the barn. The dog started barking. Suddenly Ned was alert. He shook Will awake, then poked his spyglass out into the night. 4 torches, gauzy in the falling snow, were moving in a file along the road and coming in through the gate. He could just make out a couple of figures, one of them carrying the long barrel of a musket. He turned to Will, who was already on his feet. "They're here," he whispered. 4 at least." Will nodded. He handed Ned his pair of pistols, then, taking his own and thrusting them into his pockets, he disappeared swiftly down the ladder, clutching his sword. Their plan was to split their firepower, give an impression of greater force. Ned went back to his lookout. He poked one of the pistols into the gap and bent his head next to it. He had the advantage of height, about 10 feet of it. The familiar sensations before a fight, a tightness in his chest, a sharpening of his heartbeat, a peculiar cold calm. Oliver's voice, "Never wait for the attack to come to you, Ned." The torches were closing in on the barn. He took aim at the nearest of the flames and fired. A brilliant flash of powder, a deafening explosion, the smell of singed hair. He saw the torch drop, transferred his second pistol into his right hand, aimed again, fired again. Didn't wait to see the result, but threw the pistols onto the straw, grabbed his sword, and swung himself onto the ladder. There was such a ringing in his ears from the noise of the firing that he could barely hear the crack of Will discharging his own rounds from the door in quick succession. He thought he heard a shot returned from outside. There was just sufficient light reflecting off the snow for him to make out Will standing, his back to the wall, his sword drawn, discharged pistols at his feet. He came up close and spread his hands. "Where are they?" Will shrugged and shook his head. "We beat the dogs, Will." "Aye, but they'll be back. Perhaps even at first light. And there'll be more of them. And they'll be readier." Will was right, of course. If they stayed where they were dead men. Episode 5. The colonels sat close to the kitchen fire. Steam rose from their damp clothes. They recounted how they had repelled the attack, then listened in silence as Gookin told them of events in Boston. The Massachusetts Great and General Court had spent an entire day discussing their presence in the colony.
Governor Endicott asked me to convey his personal regrets, but to warn you he has no choice except to issue an arrest warrant. He'll try to delay it for a day or two so that you can get a head start. Even so, the colony has become too dangerous for you. Bounty hunters will soon be the least of your worries.
Will said,
Then where are we to go? I think it must be the Connecticut Valley.
Is that not a great distance away?
It is, 100 miles or thereabouts. But its remoteness is its advantage. Connecticut is Puritan country, much more so than Boston. You'll not find many royalists there. And I know the state governor, John Winthrop. Hartford would be the town to aim for.
Ned said,
Can we get so far in such weather? It can be done. It won't be easy, mind. At this time of year there's no forage, so it would be necessary to take only one horse to carry supplies and baggage.
We'd need to walk.
Yes, but there are some Indian settlements along the trail where we could shelter overnight. The old Connecticut path can be hard to follow in winter, but I know it well enough.
Mary looked at him, alarmed.
You go with them? Who else can guide them? They'd never manage such a distance alone.
Even on that first morning, when their route was no more arduous than an English park in midwinter, Ned struggled to keep pace with the two younger men. At noon, when they reached the edge of the forested mountain, the going became much harder. Ned lagged in the rear, treading in their footsteps. Every so often they had to stop and wait for him to catch up. As soon as he drew level, he would wheezily assure them he was experiencing no difficulty. The fourth time it happened, he gave up the pretense and accepted Will's suggestion that he should ride. The other two shouldered the extra bags while he swayed in the saddle, humiliated and cursing his old bones. It was on the 6th day of their journey that they came out of the tree line to confront a river, more than 100 yards across, majestic in the wilderness, brown with melted ice and snow, running high against its banks. Twigs and branches swirled past them in the foaming current as fast as a man on horseback and were borne away downstream. They contemplated it in awe.
"Gentlemen,"
announced Gookin with a modest flourish of his hand,
"the Connecticut."
Hartford looked much like Cambridge, only larger and more densely packed with wooden houses. Gookin led them towards a large dwelling that he said was Governor Winthrop's. He took them into a barn where they could wait out of sight while he went off to the house. Presently he returned, followed by a stout man in his middle 50s, carrying a lamp. He lifted it and shone it in the regicides' faces.
"Governor," said Gookin, "allow me to present Edward Whalley and William Goffe."
Ned noticed that Winthrop did not offer them his hand.
"We are sorry, sir, for putting you in this position."
Winthrop didn't speak, but continued to examine them.
"I've explained the situation to the governor," said Gookin. "Unfortunately, he doesn't think it possible for you to stay in Connecticut."
Winthrop set down the lamp and cleared his throat.
"Forgive me, gentlemen. I have a responsibility to the people of this colony. There's certainly much sympathy for your cause. Even so, I cannot guarantee that some Judas wouldn't be tempted by a reward of £200, and that would bring the wrath of the government in England down upon all our heads. You can shelter here tonight, but you must move on before first light. I'm sorry."
"Move on?" Ned repeated dully.
"Where exactly?"
Gookin said,
"Well, that is the root of the matter. The governor suggests New Haven." "And how much further on is that?" "Another 40 miles.
Will groaned.
Ned said, "Why would we be any safer in New Haven than Connecticut?"
Winthrop said,
"It is an independent colony, founded 20 years ago on strict principles drawn from the Scriptures. They don't acknowledge the king's authority. Indeed, they don't acknowledge any authority save God's. I know the minister there, John Davenport. I'll arrange for a local man to guide you."
Will turned to Gookin in surprise. "You'll not be coming with us, Dan?"
"I don't know the way so well."
Gookin looked embarrassed.
"Besides, I promised Mary I'd be home within 2 weeks. You'll be in safe hands with a local guide, I assure you."
From the outset, Ned entertained certain misgivings about their new host, although he kept them to himself, and he could see that Will found his views congenial. Like Davenport, he was a millenarian and believed that in 1666, the year of the beast, as foretold in the Book of Revelation, Christ would return to earth. Ned himself did not subscribe to the doctrine, but he knew insufficient theology to argue about it. Besides, he was beholden to Davenport for his hospitality. He reckoned the mansion must consist of 24 rooms, half of them unused. Davenport claimed his study boasted 1,000 volumes. Ned's own chamber looked out to the broad harbour and the distant sea. The ailing John, who never emerged, was the family's only child. Elizabeth Davenport flitted wraith-like between the kitchen, her son's room, and the room in which she slept, not with her husband, he noticed. The food was poor, the place was cold. There was an odd, unpleasant odour. Taken altogether, it was a strange household. 3 days after their arrival, on the Lord's Day, Davenport took them to the crowded meeting-house. Afterwards, on the green, he summoned the leading citizens of the town to meet his eminent guests, among them Nicholas Street, who had replaced William Hooke as assistant minister, and William Jones, a grave young man who had sailed over with the colonels on the Prudent Mary. Street said,
"And how long do you intend to remain in New Haven, Colonel Whalley?"
"For as long as you will have us, Mr. Street. We still have hopes of a political change in London."
Will said,
"We are willing to work, of course. Did you have any occupations before you joined the army?"
"We did," said Ned. "A draper and a salter, although all we've known for nigh on 20 years is soldiering."
"But that is a skill you can practice here," said Davenport. "We have great need of experienced soldiers. You must train our militia."
There were encampments of the Quinnipiac tribe all around New Haven. As a precaution against attack, every male citizen of the colony was obliged to give up 6 days a year for training. By chance, the next was fixed for Wednesday of that week. The two colonels fell naturally into their former roles in the new model army. Will oversaw the pike and musket men, instructing them in drill and target practice. Ned lectured on tactics to the cavalry in a meadow just outside the town. One evening, over supper, Davenport described how the colony was administered.
"Ours is a theocratic state, the only colony in America in which the secular authorities must defer to the divine."
Nevertheless, there was an acting governor of the New Haven colony, and on Tuesday the 26th of March, the man discharging that responsibility, Mr. William Leet, arrived. He was carrying with him a copy of the warrant that Governor Endicott had finally been obliged to issue in Boston for the arrest of the detestable regicides Whalley and Goffe. They passed it from one to another in dismay. Davenport said,
"Endicott has no jurisdiction in New Haven. We shall ignore it. We acknowledge God alone."
Leet rubbed his hands unhappily.
"You are right, in principle, as always, Mr. Davenport. But those states are established by royal charter, and ours, at present, is not. And if it becomes known that we are harbouring 2 men who signed the king's death warrant, it never will be. We've existed here for 20 years without need of any charter, for most of which time England was a commonwealth and the government sympathetic. Now I fear matters are very different."
Davenport took the warrant, slowly tore it up, and let the fragments flutter to the floor.
"That is what I think of Endicott and his warrant,
and of Charles Stuart for that matter, both first and second. Has Boston sent any men to carry out these arrests? Not so far. You see, they do not dare. But they will come, Mr. Davenport, said Leete quietly, sooner or later, and our militia will not be sufficient to withstand them.
Ned raised his hand. Plainly, we cannot continue to live here. So the old problem remains. Where are we to go? He hesitated. I have a notion of what to do, although it would not be without risk, to you gentlemen as much as to us. He stopped.
We are not afraid of risk, said Davenport. Go on.
The colonels left New Haven the following morning. Before they exited the town, they made a point of riding right the way around the green, saying thanks and farewell to everyone they recognized. When, soon afterwards, they were seen to set out along the westerly coastal road, it was naturally assumed that they must be heading for the Dutch colony, perhaps to take ship at New Amsterdam for Holland. After 10 miles, they came to the town of Milford, part of the colony of New Haven. They stopped at the general store and bought a few items from its owner, Micah Tompkins, asked the distance to New Amsterdam, then left. On their way out, they noticed, pinned up on a board, the bulletin offering a reward for their capture. It was obvious from the way some of the men in the store stared at them that they had been recognized. Good. They found a small clearing next to a stream. They lay down to wait. It must have been midnight before they returned at last to Davenport's, where a candle lit an upstairs window. Nobody saw them go inside, and they did not venture out again for another 5 weeks. As far as the town was concerned, they had gone. Richard Naylor sailed into Boston Bay on a sunny afternoon on the last day of April, at the end of an 8-week crossing of the North Atlantic. On the quayside, he squinted and tried to take his bearings. A balmy day, an unusual brightness of light playing across the sparkling water, vivid greens and blues, the cries of unfamiliar seabirds, a smell in the air he couldn't quite place, a strange, sweet spiciness. England, and yet not England. Episode 6. The rooming house occupied the central part of a terrace along a narrow street close to the harbour. Naylor had invited the men to meet him on Friday afternoon. He took a table in the corner of the public chamber. Breeden had already told him something of the men. Thomas Kelland, the younger of the two, owned a ship which he had named the Charles, an act that gave a fair clue to his politics. Kirke had fought in the war on the King's side, then fled to New England when Cromwell took power. The three shook hands. Naylor poured wine. He raised his tankard. To the King. The King. They drank. Well then, Naylor said, let us settle straight to business. He looked around to make sure he would not be overheard. As our mutual friend Captain Breeden has explained in his letters, I am an officer of the Privy Council, charged with bringing to justice those criminals still wanted for the murder of the King's father. I've come from London with an order signed by His Majesty directing Governor Endicott to proceed at once to discover and arrest Colonel Edward Whalley and Colonel William Goffe. You've heard of them? Both men nodded. Naylor went on. Doubtless then you're also aware that Mr. Endicott and the Marshal General, Mickelson, have been, how shall we put it, less than diligent in their efforts to apprehend the traitors. So it's my intention to raise a group of reliable men to hunt down these murderers myself. He leaned forwards. I would like you two gentlemen to organize and lead the chase. My intelligence is that they were last seen living openly in Cambridge, but that was some time ago. Doubtless they've moved on since."
"I know for a fact that they have," said Kirk. "There was an attempt to take them in February, which the villains saw off easily enough by firing pistols. When our side went back to try again, there was no sign of them. Naturally, the Gookins deny all knowledge."
"The Gookins?"
"Daniel and Mary Gookin. Theirs is the house where the Colonel stayed. Gookin is a man of some prominence locally. He held office under Cromwell in England. My guess is they'll have headed west. The Puritans are very strong in Connecticut."
The discussion got down to practicalities. They settled on a hunting party of 8, the 3 of them, plus a guide, and 4 others. Naylor suggested they hire Scotchmen, as it seemed they would be up for a fight. By 6, their business was complete. Just before Kirk and Kelland left, Naylor asked them where he might find the Gookins' house. The next morning, Naylor was riding out of Boston to see the place where Whalley and Goffe had stayed. The Gookins' house was the first genuinely attested link to them he had found after nearly a year of searching. It had been his intention to walk his horse slowly past the house, complete a circuit of the town, and then return to Boston. But as he drew level, a well-built man in shirt-sleeves and a leather jerkin came out of the barn carrying a bundle of hay and stopped to look at him. Their eyes met.
"Are you lost, friend?"
Naylor drew up his horse. He could not resist the opportunity. "I'm looking for 2 acquaintances of mine, Mr. Richardson and Mr. Stevenson."
"There are none of those names here."
"You are Mr. Gookin?"
"I am, sir."
"Then you might know them better as Colonel Edward Whalley and Colonel William Goffe." Gookin shook his head.
"Those 2 have long gone."
"How long ago?"
"December, I believe."
"December? Yet that is a full 6 months after they were declared wanted men by Parliament."
"News from Parliament reaches us very slowly."
"In truth, were they not still here in February? I'm told there was a fight."
"There's no proof that was them. Most probably it was vagrants sheltering in the barn. I know nothing more of the business."
"Vagrants armed with pistols. Come now, Mr. Gookin. Is it not an offence against your faith to lie?" Gookin lifted his burden, smiled, and gestured with it towards Naylor.
"You see, I must get on. Good day to you."
Naylor felt his anger rising. He tried to staunch it, but the condescension of that smile was infuriating. "You must give up where they are, sir, otherwise you too will be found guilty of treason by reason of harbouring them. And the penalty for that is not pretty, let me assure you."
"Who are you? You say you were acquainted with the colonels. How?"
"From a Christmas day some years ago. They'll not remember me, but when you see them next, you may say that I have not forgotten them, and I shall find them." A little over a week later, Naylor donned his best suit of clothes, retrieved the royal mandate from beneath his bed, and set off to visit Governor Endicott. Kelland and Kirk were sitting downstairs in the rooming house when he returned. Naylor patted his document case. "I have it all. The warrant signed and executed, letters from Endicott to the governors of Connecticut, New Haven, and Plymouth, enclosing a copy of the King's mandate. They are ordered to assist us. He's even signed a letter to Stuyvesant, Director of New Netherland, requesting the cooperation of the Dutch. Come, let's not waste another moment." He walked with the others to the harbour. The hunting party had been waiting all day, along with their horses, arms, and supplies, in a warehouse belonging to Kelland. Kirk made the introductions, beginning with their guide, John Chapin. He was rumoured to have some Indian blood. The 4 Scotsmen, all taken prisoner after the Battle of Dunbar in 1650, were in their early 30s. Naylor shook hands with each of them. He liked the look of their leanness, their sinewy, muscled arms, and especially the hatred in their eyes. They were like a pack of hungry hounds. "So," he said, "are you men all eager for the chase?" A ragged chorus of "Aye, sir." "Good, because so am I." Never had he felt more alive. He could not stop laughing. He swung himself up onto his horse. They clattered over the cobbles as people turned to watch, out of the harbour, up through the streets of Boston. And when they reached the open country, they turned westwards, the sun in their faces, across the plain, towards the dark line of the forest. Only 8 people knew the secret of the Colonel's return to New Haven. The 3 members of the Davenport family, the Davenport's 2 servants, the assistant minister, Nicholas Street, William Jones, the son of the regicide, and Governor Leete. Their lives, without them being conscious of it, became semi-nocturnal, retiring to bed just before dawn and sleeping until noon, when their dinner was brought up to them. Increasingly, Ned's mind took refuge in the past. He would lie on his bed and relive the tumultuous episodes of his life, so vastly different to his present non-existence. The things he had seen, the battles and sieges, the feasts with the king at Hampton Court, and then His Majesty's trial and execution, the eviction of Parliament at gunpoint, the splendour of the Lord Protector in Whitehall Palace and Hampton Court, Cromwell's death. It was while he was indulging in one of these waking dreams that it occurred to him that he might better pass the endless crawl of time by writing them down. He walked down the passage to Davenport's study and knocked on the door. The room was empty. The desk was the kind a schoolmaster might use. He raised the lid, took one of the sheets of paper upon which the minister composed his thunderous sermons, picked up a pen from the rack, dipped the nib in the inkwell, and wrote, "Some memories of the life of His Highness the late Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell, by his cousin, Colonel Edward Whalley." That was as far as he got. He had scarcely lifted his pen from the paper to compose his thoughts, when he sensed Oliver at his back, leaning over his shoulder, demanding to know what impertinence was this. "People ask me about you all the time," he muttered. "Then let the damn fools ask, but leave me be." The voice was so real he felt the hairs rise on his scalp. He folded up the paper and left the study. He wondered if he was going mad. But the following afternoon he was back, and this time he did not hesitate, but charged full tilt at his objective. He dipped his pen in the inkwell, found he had drained it. Where would he find more? There was none that he could see in the small compartments that lined the back of the desk. The pair of drawers above his knees was locked. However, he had seen Davenport hide the key between 2 volumes on the nearby shelves. He retrieved it. The second drawer was crammed with coloured bottles, neatly labelled. They were not ink. Some of the names he did not recognise, but 2 he did: Mercury and Guiacum. There could hardly be an officer of any army in Europe obliged to deal with rampant soldiers during a campaign who would not have recognised the standard treatment for gonorrhea. Ned had seen too much to be shocked for long. Still, he found it hard to meet Davenport's eye when he met him the next afternoon, and he detected a corresponding unease in the minister. He wondered whether he could have failed to return the key to its exact hiding place, or left the medicine bottles slightly out of order. Whatever the truth, it was plain that Davenport suspected his secret had been discovered, because soon afterwards he suggested that the time had come for the colonels to leave. "Questions have begun to be asked at the store regarding the amount of food we are ordering," he explained. "Nearly twice what it was before. I have spoken to William Jones, and he is happy to take you under his roof for a spell." "We understand," said Will. "When do you wish us to leave?" "We thought tonight." The colonels had just finished supper and were spending the final hour before bed in their adjoining rooms. By that Saturday evening, they had been resident under the Joneses' roof for exactly 12 days. It was around 9 when they heard an urgent knocking at the front door. Both men looked up. A minute later, they heard Jones running up the stairs. He went straight into Ned's room, out of breath, in a panic.
"There's a search party in Guildford, come from Boston to arrest you."
Will appeared in the doorway behind him. Ned rose to his feet. Despite expecting it for so many months, now that it had happened, the thing felt unreal. When did they arrive?
2 or 3 hours since. Governor Leete will try to hold them up, but we've no time to waste. Your bags are packed.
The colonels nodded.
"There is a ruined mill," said Jones. "The other side of town. I'll show you the way and help carry your bags."
A few minutes later, they were slipping out of the gate and into the wide, grassy street. Jones led the way with a lamp. It was a small, stone-built dwelling, abandoned years before and since reclaimed by nature, covered in ivy and brambles.
"I'm sorry," Jones said. "At least you should be dry for a night or two. I'll return on Monday."
"Such a desolate, haunted spot," said Ned. He thought it looked exactly the sort of place where a pair of desperate outlaws might make their last stand. On Monday, Ned, sitting in the mill house on his spread-out coat, heard the cracking of twigs outside. He and Will both seized their pistols, but before they were even properly on their feet, Jones was in the doorway.
"They've come for you. They're at the Davenports now."
The colonels hoisted their bags. "The hills," said Ned. "It'll have to be." Episode 7. A cottage built of stone appeared ahead, and the figure of a man in white shirt-sleeves chopping logs. Jones said,
"Wait here. I'll speak with him."
Ned dropped his bag and sank gratefully to the forest floor, legs stretched out. "Take heart," said Will. "We've been in tighter scrapes."
"If so, I'd be obliged if you could name them."
Will laughed at that, and after a few moments Ned joined in. Jones returned with the farmer.
"This is Richard Sperry. He'll show you a place where you can shelter. I'll return as soon as it's safe."
He embraced them both, and with a final "God be with you," set off back to New Haven. Sperry set off without a word. They followed him, first to the yard of his cottage, where he collected his axe and a weighty coil of rope, and then for about a mile along the path, climbing ever steeper, until abruptly he left it and led them into the gloom of the forest. Through the trees they saw a waterfall, plunging a good 40 feet over the edge of a rust-coloured cliff face into a pool that fed a stream. Sperry said, "Stay here." He looped the rope around his neck, tucked the axe into his thick leather belt, and began to climb the cliff, swinging from foothold to foothold as he ascended the sheer rock. "By heavens," Ned muttered. "Does he mean for us to follow him?" Sperry reached the top and vanished over the edge. A moment later he reappeared and began paying out the rope. He shouted down, "I'll start with the bags." They tied Ned's first, and Sperry hauled it up quickly, banging it against the rock. He took the next bag, and then called down to Will to tie the rope around his waist. Ned could not bear to watch. But then he thought he must, to see how it was done. When Will finished his ascent, Sperry paid out the rope again. Ned was sure he could never manage it. He shouted up, "No, I cannot. I am too old and too heavy." "Come on, Colonel," shouted Sperry. "I've fought at Marston Moor. If you can beat a king, you can beat a bit of rock." A veteran, thought Ned. He'd never lost face in front of his men. He'd be damned if he'd do so now. The last part was the worst, swaying out in the breeze over the sheer drop. But then he closed his eyes and scrabbled the last couple of steps, and Will leaned out and grasped his wrist and dragged him to safety. He stood and brushed away the dirt on his coat and surveyed the spot. A wall of rock behind them, with a cleft in it as wide as a man and twice as high, which looked as though it might lead to a cave. A cascade of water into a clear pool, and a view, with New Haven's grid of streets plainly visible.
Sperry said, "The cave is dry. There's another track to the top, but hard to find. You should be safe enough."
"Shelter, water, aspect," said Ned. "It is the perfect place." He climbed up onto a boulder. "We can keep a good lookout from up here." He extended his spyglass and trained it on New Haven. He observed the party of riders moving through the town. He continued to watch them until they disappeared into the wood. He lowered the telescope. "I count 8 men, doubtless coming our way." The search party toiled on up the track until they came out onto the summit of the ridge of hills. The plain of New Haven spread beneath them.
"Well, we're here, Mr. Naylor," said Kirk. "Now what do you intend?"
"To rest a while and then continue." Kirk looked around at the others, as if seeking their support.
"You could put an army up here for a week and they still find nothing. Would it not be more profitable to follow their trail towards New Amsterdam?"
"But if it really was their plan to board a ship to Holland, don't you think they would have taken pains to keep it secret? You may embark on a wild goose chase, but I shall search for them here."
"Very well. That's what we shall do, if the others all agree."
They did. As they mounted to return to New Haven, Kirk called down from his saddle.
"We shall meet up with you on the road to New Amsterdam. God be with you."
"Very well, then. Alone." Naylor rode slowly along the ridge. He came to a stream that ran a little distance, then poured over the lip of the ridge. He tied his horse to a stunted oak and picked his way between the boulders and bushes until he thought he saw a promising spot. He sat and gently eased himself over the edge until his feet were dangling, then turned and began to descend. A couple of minutes later, he dropped onto the ledge. He drew his pistol from his belt, cocked it, and moved forwards. There was a narrow cleft in the rock. He had to twist to squeeze his body into the gap. The aperture widened slightly, and he was in a passage. He stood, listening. A silence as profound as the darkness. He brought up his pistol and held it at arm's length, aiming it into the black emptiness as he ventured towards the interior. Now it seemed limitless. He could no longer feel the walls. He felt entirely disorientated, adrift in space. Suddenly he couldn't breathe. Arms flailing, he lurched in a panic towards where he imagined the wall must be. He banged his shoulder against it, clung onto it for a few moments while he recovered his nerve, then felt his way along the rock, around the corner, back towards the narrow entrance and the blinding crack of light. Behind him, at the far end of the cave, their guns still cocked and pointed, the colonels stood motionless in the absolute dark. In New Amsterdam, Naylor sat on a capstan on the harbour front. He tapped his pipe on the side and blew down the stem to clear it. He recognized defeat. The following afternoon he sailed for Boston. "You have eluded me this time," thought Naylor. "But I have raised such a hue and cry against you that if you are still here, I believe your lives will be quite wretched. You cannot hide forever. I shall have you one day." The colonels' lives had indeed become quite wretched. But on the third morning they let down the rope, and Sperry scaled the rock face.
"Mr. Jones asked me to tell you that you must keep away from the towns until he advises otherwise."
"But we cannot stay here forever," protested Ned.
"Not here. I know a better spot."
The second place was not so much a cave as a heap of 6 massive rocks. Like a pagan temple, thought Ned, a natural Stonehenge. It was well screened by surrounding trees, yet it offered an even more commanding view than the last. Sperry said,
"There is a stream further down you may fish, and plenty of wood for a fire. You have your pistols?" Ned patted his pocket. "I advise you keep them by you. There are wolves and bears and mountain lions that might disturb you. Mr. Jones promises he will come and fetch you when it's safe to move."
"And when might that be?"
asked Will. Sperry shrugged. Who knew? Ned and Will's days in the wilderness were carefully scratched into the rock by Will. But for his meticulous record-keeping, they would have had no notion of the passage of time as the days merged into one another. On the 19th day of August, Ned, atop the highest rock, saw through his telescope 4 figures approaching on horseback. No, there were only 2 men on horseback. The other 2 horses were riderless. The men were Jones and Sperry.
"The time has come," said Jones. "We have found you a place for the winter."
A small settlement emerged out of the dusk, and it wasn't until night had fallen that Ned realized they were in Milford, at Micah Tompkins' store. Jones knocked, and Tompkins appeared with a lamp. He conducted them across the yard to an outbuilding. He shifted a few things, lifted a trapdoor, and held his lamp above it. "It's dry, at least. You should be safe down there. I'll return in the morning." He gave the lamp to Will, who thanked him and at once began to descend. Ned, after a brief hesitation, followed him down a ladder to a stone floor. Above their heads, the trapdoor dropped. Richard Naylor returned to London from Boston at the end of July. The following spring, he sailed to Rotterdam, resolved to intensify his inquiries into those regicides still at liberty on the continent. On the morning of Sunday the 16th of March, the Blackamoor dropped anchor in the Thames estuary at Gravesend. Mr. Pepys of the Navy Board, on Hyde's orders, sent a barge to meet it, and 3 regicides were transferred to the vessel's enclosed cabin at the stern. They reached the Tower at dusk. The next morning, Naylor went direct to Whitehall Palace, where Samuel Noakes was clutching a file and waiting to congratulate him. After Naylor had described the arrests, Noakes opened his file.
"Do you recall the merchant Samuel Wilson we suspected of carrying secret messages between the Puritans in London and America?"
"Of course."
"Whilst you were in Holland, I discovered that his ship was about to sail, and arranged for it to be searched."
He laid a thick letter in front of Naylor. "Reverend Davenport. Now there is a piece of work." He skimmed the pages until he reached the end. Signed D.G. Who was he?
"The meaning of the initials is unclear, but judging by the contents, he is a Puritan minister who at one time lived with Davenport."
"William Hook?"
"That is my belief, and you might care to look more closely at the very last part."
"I pray salute my relations you mentioned in one of your last. Tell them our friends here are well." Naylor looked up at Noakes. "His relations? That would be Whalley and Goffe."
"Almost certainly. The friends most likely include Francis Goffe." Folded into the letter was a second message. He handed over the note with a flourish. It was in a very different hand, uneducated, almost childish. "One of our agents reported that a woman visited Wilson's house the day before he was due to sail. She was described as in her 20s, thin and poor-looking."
"Francis Goffe. Do we know where she is living?"
"She was in Swan Alley with the Hooks, but they must have got wind of Wilson's arrest. They have moved again."
Naylor struck the table in frustration. The 2 colonels had been living in Micah Tompkins' cellar for exactly a year. Will carried a letter from Francis over to the part of the cellar beneath the grill where there was just enough weak winter light for him to make out Francis's awkward hand. He read it through, and then went back to the sentence,
"My Uncle Birkett is dead, and my mother is with him."
It was a shy way to convey such terrible news, but after years of illness, Catherine Whalley was at peace with God. He glanced across the cellar at Ned, who was leaning forwards in his chair, watching him eagerly. "Come then, Will. What does she say?" "You should read it for yourself, Ned." When Ned had finished reading, he sat back in his chair, staring into the distance, the letter still clutched in his hand. Episode 8. The third anniversary of Ned and Will's incarceration in Micah Tompkins' cellar arrived in mid-August 1664. Neither man remarked upon the date. What was there to say? The following afternoon, Tompkins appeared with Reverend Davenport. Without preliminaries, Davenport announced, "An expedition of English warships has arrived in Gravesend Bay. 4 men-of-war with 400 soldiers. They are commissioned by the Duke of York to force the surrender of New Amsterdam and to capture you." Tompkins wanted them gone by morning. They reached the inescapable conclusion that the only option was their old refuge in the rocks above New Haven. After their visitors had gone, Ned sat slumped in his chair opposite Will. The prospect of yet more weeks spent living in the wild, with no end in sight, was dreadful to him. He was 65. He was not sure he could survive it. Eventually he said, "I know I've always been the one who's urged us to flee, but now I wonder if we wouldn't do better to surrender ourselves." "Surely you don't imagine they would show us mercy?" "No, but we'd be taken back to London for execution, where at least we'd have a last chance to say goodbye to our families. And we'd show manly resolution, and have the martyrs' deaths you've always craved." Will did not reply immediately. Then he reached for his Bible and searched for the passage he wanted. "We are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Cast down, but not destroyed." St. Paul to the Corinthians. He put his hand on Ned's and looked at him intently. "Another year, and all will be well, I promise you." "How can you know that?" "Because in the year of our Lord 1666, Christ will return. You were right. We must keep the faith, Ned, and live to see God's kingdom here on earth." They picked up the familiar trail that led north and arrived at their old home among the rocks. Within a day, it was as if they had never left. In the 3rd week of October, 2 English warships appeared in New Haven Bay. The colonels watched through Ned's spyglass as they sailed down the harbour channel and dropped anchor. After half an hour, both frigates lowered a pair of longboats crammed with soldiers. They spent the rest of that day and the whole of the next morning clearing their camp. Then they walked into the nearby woods and used Sperry's old rope to climb a massive oak, its lower branches wide and straight enough for them to each lie full length, head to toe. They kept their swords and pistols with them in case it came to a fight. Showers overnight soaked them to the skin. By morning, Ned's teeth were chattering with the beginnings of a chill. In the afternoon, through his fever, he heard men's voices. Lifting his head, he saw 4 redcoats emerging along the ridge from the west. Ned listened to them removing their bayonets, priming their muskets. They advanced towards the trees and passed in single file directly beneath the oak. The sounds faded. The colonels stayed in the tree till nightfall. By this time, Ned was shaking so much it was hard for him to climb down. For 3 days his fever continued. On the 4th morning, he woke without a temperature. He managed to stand and carefully climbed to the top of the rocks. The harbour channel was empty. The warships had gone. That afternoon they had their first friendly visitor for 2 months. William Jones brought them provisions. While he watched them eat, he said, "A new refuge has been prepared for you both. This is to be permanent at last. Sperry will guide you."
"Where are we to go?" Ned asked.
"Hadley, Massachusetts."
He glanced at Will, who shrugged. "We've not heard of it."
"Nobody has, that's the beauty of it. Hadley's a new community, the farthest point of English settlement in the whole of America. As far as the outside world is concerned, you will have ceased to exist." Reverend John Russell had modified his house over the past month to accommodate his expected guests. On the upper floor, he showed them 2 good-sized bedrooms, where candles had been lit.
"And now look at this. I finished it last week."
He opened a door onto a narrow connecting passage running behind the chimney between the 2 bedrooms. It exuded a smell of fresh paint and sawdust. Halfway along, he pulled up a couple of loose boards. He beckoned them to come and see, and shone his lamp over a ladder leading down into the darkness.
"There's a small chamber hidden behind the chimney on the ground floor. If anyone comes looking for you, you can conceal yourselves there."
"Most ingenious," said Ned. "That is the hole where I shall crawl to die," he thought. On the penultimate day of January 1665, Naylor was summoned to see the Lord Chancellor. Sir Edward Hyde was still in his old room in Worcester House.
"We have received a dispatch from Colonel Nichols in Boston. It seems the Dutch have been subdued without the necessity to fire a shot. New Amsterdam is now New York."
"Congratulations, my lord. That is a great triumph."
"Is it? We shall soon have a war with the Dutch that will cost us $2 million a year."
Naylor squirmed in his chair. He was almost certain that Hyde was unaware that the initial suggestion had come from Naylor himself. But with the old man one never knew.
"Colonel Nichols commissioned a thorough search for Colonels Whalley and Goffe." "Nothing."
Naylor slumped in his chair. "So they have defeated us."
"If you count it a victory to live 3,000 miles from home, unable to show your face out of doors, I would not call it such. Well, there it is. I have decided the time has come to dissolve the Regicide Committee. I am sure your talents can be better employed elsewhere."
Naylor braced himself.
"I had you in mind to be my private secretary. You will not turn me down, I hope?"
"No, my lord. I should be honoured."
"Even so, you may wish for more time to consider it. This war we shall soon have with the Dutch will not be easy, and next year is the one to which the millennialists attach such significance."
"It is just a year, like any other."
"But many thousands believe otherwise, and will be alert for portents, such as that comet, which was held to be a prodigy. A febrile mood can bring its own Armageddon."
"I still accept, my lord, most humbly and willingly."
"Then I suggest you move your apartments here to Worcester House. Shall we say tomorrow?"
In his room, Naylor started sorting through 4.5 years' worth of papers, making a pile of those he wished to have sent to Worcester House. The rest he burned on his fire. He found a file marked William Goffe, and took out the note the colonel had sent to his wife. He knelt before the grate and held it towards the flames until his fingers began to burn, at which point he thought better of it, snatched it back, and put it with the other documents to go to Worcester House. Beyond the mullioned window, although he did not yet know it, England's Armageddon was beginning. A couple of miles to the northeast, in Holborn, Frances Goffe was hurrying home. She had just passed the church of St. Giles in the Fields, when she noticed that the crowd ahead of her had diverted its course, like a stream flowing around a boulder. As she drew level, jostled by the bodies around her, she saw what it was they were avoiding. A house, standing isolated, its door and windows boarded up, a red crucifix a foot high painted on the planks. Someone told her the family were locked inside. As soon as Frances got home, she told Uncle William. She knew what it meant, although there had not been plague in London in her lifetime. Hook said,
"The Book of Revelation tells us that the apocalypse will be heralded by 4 horsemen: death, war, famine, and the Antichrist. This is death. It is the beginning of the end of days."
Flattened by time and distance, the ripples of great events did not reach Hadley until roughly 4 months after they had occurred. It was only in October 1665 that Ned and Will heard that the war with the Dutch had begun with a defeat at sea, a cause for celebration among men hoping to hear of divine punishment of the old country. They then had to wait another 3 months until January 1666 before gradually coming to appreciate the severity of the plague. This did indeed sound like God's punishment. But privately, Ned prayed for the plague to abate, and gave thanks later in the year when they learned that it had. It was not until the end of December 1666, in the last few days of that portentous year, that word of the Great Fire finally spread to the banks of the Connecticut. Exactly the same parishes were affected as had been visited by the plague. It was as if God, in his infinite wisdom, had decided that those few square miles of London were the fulcrum of all the evil in the world. On New Year's Day 1667, Ned rose at first light and threw open his shutters. The world was still there. Ned's strength was weakening fast now. His life, his wounds, were catching up with him. Some days he could barely get out of bed. One morning he woke to find Oliver looking down at him. "Get on your feet, you milksop!"
"I cannot, Your Highness. I lack the strength."
"What is this, Your Highness? Surely I am plain Oliver to you, and have been since we were boys."
"Really? As I recall, you were always most particular about your title, even in private."
"Ha! You think I desired that bauble? The people of England still hankered after a king, and by the grace of God I was the next best thing. But I never wanted it."
"Yet you named your son to be your successor, just as if you were a king. You cut off the king's head and left us a void. Richard was never fit to be Lord Protector. You must have known it. What were we to do, Oliver? Oliver?"
But he had gone. Will stood in his stockinged feet on the landing outside Ned's bedroom door. He could hear his father-in-law muttering to himself. Ned heard the creak of floorboards on the landing.
"Will, is that you?"
His words sounded in his ears like gibberish. It took him 3 or 4 attempts to roll over onto his side, and then he struggled to put his feet to the carpet. With an effort, he pushed himself up off the mattress and just about managed to stand. His head ached so much he was almost blind. He took a few tottering steps through the fog towards the door and stood swaying for a moment before he crashed full length. Episode 9. One day, when he was cleaning Ned's room not long after his seizure, Will shifted his father-in-law's old army bag and noticed a thick sheaf of papers tucked inside. "Some memories of the life of His Highness the late Lord Protector." He glanced across at Ned. As usual, he was asleep. Overcome with curiosity, he carried the manuscript into his own room and started to read until Ned needed feeding and cleaning, and then went back to it. The early part was unobjectionable enough. It was only when Ned began to address Frances directly that the tone changed, and Will started to become uneasy. There was the curious sympathy and respect for Charles Stuart, his doubts about the king's trial, and then the most disturbing passage of all. "Dear Francis, one question troubles me. If the victories God gave us were proof we were doing his work, how are we to interpret what has happened since? Has he withdrawn his favour from our cause? Or were we in error all along?" Will had sat back, appalled. This could not be the man he knew. Some devil had seized his pen. Little surprised that God had struck him down. The thought that Frances might read his words was especially dreadful. She must be protected from the effect of her father's sickness. And Ned must be protected from himself. He lit a fire in his grate and burned the memoir, page by page. 7 years later, in 1674, Will sat in his father-in-law's room. There was a fit of coughing from the bed and muttering. Ned seemed agitated by something. For the first time, Will sensed the end was near. Was his father-in-law dying in the hope and expectation of resurrection? Or was his faith now lost to him, like his belief in the cause he had fought for? 2 days later, when he went into Ned's room to wash him and give him breakfast, he found him, as so often, with his eyes open, staring at the door, waiting for him. But even before he touched his shoulder, he knew that he was dead. He and Russell made the coffin together out of some of the seasoned oak planks stored in the barn, and at nightfall they carried it into the house and up the stairs. They set about digging a grave in the moonlight, beyond sight of the road and the nearest houses. When it was dug, they went up to Ned's room to fetch him. Just before they nailed down the lid, Will kissed him on the forehead. His wrinkles had gone. His skin was smooth and cold and white as marble, like the effigy of a knight in an English church. In his army coat, he looked as if he was sleeping on the eve of a battle. Will fell into a deep despair. Without Ned to care for, his days were empty. Next spring brought a slight revival in his spirits. He forced himself to order a selection of goods to barter with the Norwottucks, and towards the end of June he set out to walk to the forest. The moment he came down the track into the Norwottucks' camp, he sensed that something was wrong. The dozens of wigwams were black and silent. No fires had been left burning outside. The settlement had clearly been abandoned. A few days later, news from Boston gave the empty camp an ominous significance. 3 Indians had been convicted of murdering an Englishman and had been hanged. Among them was the chief counselor to the leader of the Wampanoag people in southeast Massachusetts, who styled himself King Philip. In a fury at the insult, he had united the scattered tribes of New England into a war coalition to drive out the foreigners once and for all. The Norwottucks near Hadley must have abandoned their camp to join him. One afternoon in the first week of August, Will heard shouts and the rumble of approaching ox carts. His side window looked east, and from it came a sorry little convoy, with families trudging alongside, their faces and clothing blackened by smoke. They passed beneath his window, and a minute later he heard a loud hammering at the door. It was the first time for years that he had been forced to hide. He lit a candle and went into the passage, lifted the planks, climbed down the ladder a few rungs, replaced the boards above his head, and descended the rest of the way to the cramped space. He could hear Russell's voice and that of another man, who must have been standing close to the fireplace. Pressing his ear to the brickwork, he was able to make out most of what he said. They had fled from Brookfield, a tiny place about 25 miles to the east of Hadley. Earlier in the week, about 20 men of the Massachusetts militia had been lured into an ambush and lost half their force, had retreated to a house into which the entire community had crammed themselves, and had managed to hold off the besieging natives for 2 full days and nights, while the town around them was burned to the ground. On the evening of the 3rd day, they had been relieved by the arrival of a Captain Parker with 4 dozen soldiers. The Indians had retreated, and the survivors had scattered to seek refuge where they could. More people came inside, more voices added to the hubbub, and after that Will could understand little of what was said. An hour passed, and gradually the volume diminished. The door closed. He heard footsteps on the stairs, and then the boards were lifted. John Russell's face appeared. "You can come out now. It's safe." "From what I overheard, I don't know that safe is the word I'd choose." For the 1000th time, Will wished Ned was still with him. He would have known what to do. That night, while the rest of the household slept, Will ventured out into the night. This was what Ned would have done, he had decided. Reconnoitre the terrain of the battle. Four years later, in Paris, on a July afternoon in 1679, an Englishman left his house in Rue Saint-Denis and walked to the Pont Neuf. In the middle of the bridge was a vendeur who specialized in the latest English publications. 50 sols secured him a 2-week-old copy of the London Intelligencer. He wandered onto the Ile de Notre Dame, but by now the jostling crowds were boring him, and he turned for home. In truth, Naylor had been bored most days ever since Hyde had died in exile, and that was 4.5 years ago. He poured himself a glass of cognac and sat down in an armchair with the London Intelligencer. His eye was caught by a small headline, "The Angel of Hadley." "Intelligence reaches us from His Majesty's province of New England of a most singular incident in that late struggle with the Indians known as the King Philip's War. The little remote town of Hadley, in September 1675, was surprised by natives called the Nowatuk and thrown into the utmost confusion, and all seemed lost, when there appeared in their midst a grave, elderly person. In his mien and dress he differed from the rest of the people. He did not merely encourage them to defend themselves, but put himself at their head, rallied, instructed, and led them on to encounter the enemy, who by this means were repulsed with heavy losses to the heathens and none to the Christians. As suddenly as he had manifested himself, however, the deliverer of Hadley disappeared, never to be seen again. The people were utterly unable to account for this exceptional phenomenon, except that it be conjured by the providence of God, and the stranger himself an angel, sent from heaven to confound the savages." Naylor set his cognac down on the floor and read the passage a second time, then a third. Whalley would be 80. He could safely be regarded as dead. But Goffe, if his memory served, was born in the same year as himself. He read it a 4th time. "By God," he muttered, "I do believe it's him." The trail was warm. The hunt was on again. By the middle of August, Naylor was in London. He took a room above a tavern in Milford Lane. When he had finished his planning, he went to see Noakes. "Frankly, Mr. Naylor, we are no longer keeping much of a lookout for the regicides. Nearly all of them are reckoned to be dead. I doubt the council will sanction another hunt." "I am willing to undertake the task myself. I require 2 things only from you. Private favours, if you will." "And what might they be?" "I would like to know the address of Mrs. Frances Goffe." "We have not kept track of her for years, but it is possible we can find her. And the other?" "The services of your best forger." The forger came to his room, a clerkish, scholarly man who gave his name as Carby. He studied Goffe's note. He made a few attempts at copying it. Naylor gave him his composition. Mr. Carby worked quickly.
"To whom should it be addressed?"
"Mrs. Frances Goffe." A couple of days later, a liveried messenger arrived from the office of the Privy Council. Naylor broke the seal on the note. "The person you seek resides at 2 Spittal Yard, Bishopsgate." It was a long time since Frances had heard from Will. She had been forced to move without any means of passing on her new address, but she recognized her husband's hand well enough. "Dearest heart, after many long years, the word so longed for may at last be spoken, as in Leviticus 25, 18-19. And if you have the strength and desire for the undertaking, which I pray you do, I implore you to carry this message to Mr. Daniel Gookin in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who will render all assistance." That was all. She had to read it several times before she grasped the meaning. He was inviting her to join him in America. Naylor watched her leave the house and hurry away from him down the street, walking so quickly it was hard for him to keep up. Outside the offices of a shipping company, she thought to check over her shoulder, then went inside. He lingered 20 yards from the entrance. After less than half an hour, she emerged and paused in the doorway. She glanced in his direction, but didn't seem to see him, apparently unaware of anything except her own happiness. And even if she had noticed him, he was sure she wouldn't have recognized him, not from a single meeting so long ago. She stepped onto the quayside and headed back the way she had come. He went to find the shipping clerk in his tiny cubicle. A bribe of 10 shillings bought him a look at the passenger manifest, where she had registered herself as Frances Stevenson. A further £5 secured him the last berth on the same ship, the Blessing, sailing from Gravesend to Boston 3 days hence, on Thursday the 21st of August. Naylor passed the night before the Blessing sailed at an inn close to the quayside. At first light, he walked down to the harbour. He was dressed in dark, drab clothes and wore the flat-crowned hat favoured by the Puritans. He showed his ticket to the purser. He was listed on the manifest under his usual pseudonym of Richard Foster. The one luxury he had, if such a word could ever be used in connection with a voyage across the Atlantic, was time. Weeks of close confinement stretched ahead. There was no need to arouse suspicion by making a hasty move. He could stalk his prey with patience. Episode 10. One day, as they were leaning on the gunwale, she revealed as much as she dared while avoiding an outright lie. She said she knew no one in America, that her husband had gone out to make a new life for them, that he had now summoned her to join him, but he had been moving around the country so much she was no longer sure where to find him.
"He has directed me to a man in Cambridge, whom he says will have the latest news of his whereabouts."
"Who is that, if you do not mind my asking?" Naylor said. She saw no reason not to tell him. "I know Daniel Gookin," he said. "Or rather, I know of him. I can certainly direct you to his house. It is barely a half-hour ride from Boston." She put her hand on his arm.
"You are very kind, Mr. Foster. I am not sure what I should have done without you."
As they neared America, they spent hours standing together at the gunwale, watching the whales and dolphins playing around the ship. Soon afterwards, seagulls began to appear overhead, and on the morning of Thursday the 30th of October, after a voyage of 69 days, the Blessing dropped anchor in Boston Harbour. The next day, they rowed together side by side to Cambridge. At the end of a bridge, Mr. Foster halted. He pointed across the river. "That is the Gookins' place, the first house on the right. I'll wait for you here." She reached the Gookins' gate and dismounted, tied the horse to the fence, and went into the yard. She knocked on the door. It was opened by a woman in her 50s.
"Yes?"
Frances said,
"I am looking for Mr. Daniel Gookin."
"He's in the barn. I'll fetch him. May I ask who wants him?
My name is Francis Stevenson.
She swallowed.
He might know me better as Francis Goffe.
The woman was so surprised it was a moment before she could speak.
Wait here.
She walked quickly across the yard to the barn, and emerged a minute later with a tall, strong-looking man with iron-grey hair and beard. "Is this true?" he said.
As God is my witness.
He glanced over her shoulder at the road. "Are you alone?"
Yes. A man from the ship showed me the way, that's all.
"Does he know your real identity?"
No.
He went to the gate to check again. "You had best come in." She sat at the kitchen table and produced the letter from Will. Gookin read it first, then passed it to his wife. "This quotation from the Scriptures.
Ye shall dwell in the land in safety, and the land shall yield her fruit. And ye shall eat your fill, and dwell therein in safety."
She smiled.
It is typical of Will to find the most apt passage.
"That is true." Daniel glanced at his wife, and then back at Francis. "And you are certain this is his hand?"
There is no doubt. Look, these are all his other letters to me.
She produced the precious bundle, tied with ribbon, and spread the contents over the table. Gookin picked one up and compared it to the message. He repeated the process several times. "I can see no difference." He turned again to his wife. "To have so many is testament in itself. I believe she speaks the truth." Mrs. Gookin said,
How many children do you have, Mrs. Goffe? 5. 4 now, one is dead.
"And their names?"
Frankie, Nan, Judith, Dickie and Betty. Betty is the one who died. My children are now grown and settled. I saw no reason not to come at once. I have travelled thousands of miles.
Francis began to cry.
Please, Mr. Gookin, tell me where he is.
Gookin blew out his cheeks and ran his hand through his grey hair. "This is difficult for us, Mrs. Goffe. I have not seen Will for many years, nor heard of him for 2 or 3. He may be dead or have moved again for all I know. As to whether it's safe—" He exchanged a final look with his wife, who nodded. "The last I heard, he was living under the protection of a Captain Bull in Hartford, Connecticut." Naylor saw her coming down the slope towards the bridge. That had not taken long. A good sign or bad? They rode together in silence. It was not until they were back in Boston that she finally spoke.
Thank you for all your trouble today, Mr. Foster.
I only hope it was successful. He let the sentence hang as a question. She did not rise to it.
What are your plans now?
She said. To find a guide to take me to Hadley. She was quiet again, thinking something over.
Where is Hadley in relation to Hartford?
Close, I think. Why Hartford? Is that where your husband is living?
I know it is a great deal to ask, but might it be possible for us to travel together?
It would be my pleasure. That night, he contemplated what lay ahead. He had developed a strong liking for Francis Goffe. The prospect of a week travelling alone together was pleasant. And at the end of it, he would kill her husband. The morning of Sunday the 9th of November 1679 found Will Goffe, as usual, in his attic refuge in the Bull's house, staring at the rafters. The place was empty. The captain and his wife had gone to the meeting house for the Sabbath assembly. He heard a faint sound downstairs. He sat up. Was it someone knocking? He rose from his bed and went over to the window. He couldn't see the front door, but when he unfastened the latch, he could hear the noise of frantic hammering and a woman's voice, faint but distinct, carrying up from the yard.
Will! Will! It's Francis!
He stumbled backwards into the centre of the room. This was madness. Torturing visions. The knocking went on for another minute, then stopped. She had gone. He stood in the silence, trying to make sense of what he had heard. What if it was her? He launched himself out of the attic and down the stairs. He unlocked the door. The yard was empty. He ran out into the road. A woman was walking away, carrying a bag. "Francis!" She stopped and turned, looked at him. He was a stranger. "Francis," he repeated. His voice, though, the sweet lilt. That was Will, no question. She ran towards him, then halted shyly a few paces away and dropped the bag. They stared at one another, each trying to reconcile the unfamiliar figure that stood before them with the one in their memories. Then he closed the distance and took her in his arms. He picked up her bag, led her back into the yard and into the house. How was it possible? She put her arms around his neck and kissed his mouth. "You wrote. I came. Did you think I would refuse?" In the ecstasy of his happiness, the words seemed to come from a long way away. He didn't take in the meaning at first. He continued to hold her, but broke away slightly. "I wrote." And then, a little uneasily, "How did you find me?" "Mr. Gookin told me." Relief for a moment. That made sense. And then the shadow returned. He had always been so careful never to mention any names. "But how do you know of Daniel?" "Your message." "What message? I sent no message. I didn't know where you were living." He stepped back from her, saw the flash of alarm in her eyes, felt his stomach hollow. "Did you come alone?" "No." The sudden tension in his voice frightened her. "Mr. Foster." "Mr. Foster? Who is Mr. Foster?" Without waiting for a reply, he shut the door and locked it. "Upstairs," he said. "Quickly." He steered her ahead of him, up onto the landing and then up a second flight to the attic. "Was it just the one man with you, or were there others?" "Just one, and a guide." "When did you last see him?" "A few minutes ago. He left me at the edge of the town. He said he was going to Hatley." She pictured Foster turning his back on her. It had been a cool parting after such a long journey together, but she hadn't wanted him to see where she was going, and he had seemed keen to get on his way. She started shaking. "Will." "It's no matter." He opened his bag and took out 2 pistols. He kept them both loaded. "Take this. Stay here. Don't come out unless I call you." He strapped on his sword. In the doorway he turned. "I'm eternally glad you came, my dearest love, whatever." He went downstairs, moving quickly from room to room, checking each window. All looked deserted. He unlocked the door and opened it. Nothing. He moved towards the gate, his pistol aimed and fully extended at shoulder height, turning in full circles, alert for any movement. He reached the gate and scanned the surrounding country. Still nothing. Colonel Goffe. A man's voice, close behind him, terrible in its calmness. "No, don't turn around. For the sake of your wife, whom I have no wish to harm, drop your pistol." He weighed his chances, reckoned them at nothing, and let the gun fall to the ground. "Kneel down." He knelt. He heard the explosion and fell forwards. What a moment of triumph this was for Naylor. What a consummation, after nearly 20 years of searching, to have his enemy kneeling helpless before him, like the king he had killed on that dreadful winter morning. He would have liked to have savoured the moment a little longer. That had been his intention. A taunt, a final word, something memorable to round it all off. But his gun must have fired prematurely. He experienced an instant of bewilderment, followed by an intense pain in the back of his neck. His mouth was full of liquid. He couldn't breathe. He staggered, half-turned. Frances was on the doorstep. The pistol in her hand was aimed directly at him. Hatred and love twisted in him. His legs buckled. He tried to say something, but all that emerged was blood. Frances dropped her father's pistol and ran past the body to Will. He started to rise. She helped him to his feet. She flung her arms around him. For a long time they stood entwined, until he whispered that they would have to move. They dragged the corpse across the road and heaved it into the ditch. Will clambered down and covered it as best he could with leaves and a few branches. He had to hurry. They didn't have long before the church meeting ended. He left all the money he could afford on the kitchen table, then went up to the attic and gathered his belongings, carrying them down to the stable, where there was a little two-wheeled buggy the Bulls used for visiting their neighbours. He hitched it to the horse and led it into the yard. He threw in Frances's bag as well as his own, helped her up onto the seat, and opened the gate. A minute later, they were on the road, heading into open country. She had her hands around his waist. Whatever happened, she would never be parted from him now. He had no idea where they would go, or what they would do, or what dangers lay ahead. But with their love and their Bible, with their absolute certainty in the power of the Lord, and the protection of their guns, and with the plentiful vastness of America spread out before them like God's table, he had faith that they would make a future.